Thanksgiving night of 1999, I did something really ignorant to someone that did not deserve it. I let my anger turn to rage, but that's not who I am anymore. I've had to deal with reliving that night for almost 24 years. I really don't know what it was that triggered me, but I believe the state should release me. I'm nowhere near as violent as I was.
I think we could all be dangerous people.
People say you're a monster.
I'm not sitting here saying I'm innocent.
I just murdered some guy in cold blood.
Growing up, I always wondered what my life would be like if my dad was here and how different things would be.
Hey, get that camera out of my face. Hey, hey.
He would be the person that I could call no matter what, and he would be there. I feel like if my dad was here, we'd be best friends. There is no excuse for what Michael Hiley did. Whether it was drugs or just mental illness or a combination of the two, I don't think there's any excuse for killing my father.
Since I've been locked up for almost the last quarter of a century, I've had to do a lot of self-reflecting. And I still do not understand why I reacted that way. It still brings up some messed up feelings when I think about that day. It wasn't something I intended. My life should have been so much better. Growing up in the south suburb of Chicago, I've lived with my mother, my grandmother, my grandfather, and a couple of siblings that I had. The only thing I knew about my father was he was in the Marine Corps, and the only real memory I have was watching him in his vehicle pull out of the yard and drive away. I started drinking around the age of 7 or 8. One of the friends that I had growing up was part of a local gang. Him and his friends were always showing up with 12 packs of beer, bottles of whiskey, and by the time I reached my 9th birthday, I would say I was a full-blown alcoholic. Being intoxicated, it helped hide some of the confusion and anger that I had, and it helped me hide some intimate details about myself that I didn't want to face. It was one of those things of trying to fit in and make sure that I had, people I could call friends. I was definitely exposed to a lot of violence. I was kind of a hothead, and I had a lot of anger. Got angry at someone, you tried to beat them up. You were throwing punches, you were throwing kicks, you were headbutting people. That was how you proved you were one of the boys. After moving to Montana, I was supposed to be working for my stepdad, but he wasn't paying me. So I decided to try and get even by stealing some rifles. I knew some people that were willing to purchase them for cash and drugs. But some of the individuals that I did business with turned in some of the hunting rifles to the police. So I was arrested. And that was the start of my prison life. Prison wasn't the learning experience that I think they wanted it to be. And even being incarcerated, I was still intoxicated. Coming out of prison, I had buried the issues with my feelings deep enough to where I wasn't dealing with them. And my main concern was where my next 12-pack is going to come from, where my next quarter gram is going to come from. I had that attitude, nobody is going to tell me I can't. So I kept drinking, kept getting high. Unfortunately, that wasn't a really good attitude to have. It was just making me more explosive. The night before Thanksgiving of 1999, I rode my pedal bike to my local bar. I brought the bike inside and left it in the corner. An old acquaintance of mine, Mr. Harris, told me he would be willing to keep an eye on it for me. So I told him I was going to be over at the pool table, and that was pretty much the start of a bad night. One of the bartenders approached me, and he accused me of being one of several people that he suspected had went back behind the bar a night or two prior and took some money out of what they call the shake-a-day container. My anger meter was raising pretty quickly. If you're going to accuse me of something, make sure I did it. I wasn't out of control angry, but I was just about there. I'm not exactly sure how much time went by, but the bartender caught my attention and said, "I'm sorry. The individual that did take the money confessed to it. But I just kept thinking about being accused of doing something I didn't do. I continued to drink. I dwelled on it. And when I glanced up, I noticed the bike was gone. My anger level instantly started to boil. I asked Mr. Harris, "Where's the bike?" And I slapped his shoulder. He turned and looked at me and told me, even if I knew where it was, I wouldn't tell you. And that was it. I went from being angry to being in a full-blown rage. I remember the bartender yelling, "Take it outside." I remember Mr. Harris coming out of the bar, walking across the street. As soon as he got close enough to me, I stabbed him 3 times. I still do not understand what it was that triggered me. I cannot even begin to speculate what was going through my mind.
Throughout his life, Michael had a habit. He gets angry, he does something, and he doesn't think about it until after he does it. I couldn't understand it. I'm Carol, and I'm Michael Hiley's mother. When Michael was younger, he was drinking all the time, and he was doing drugs, but I didn't realize he was doing that because he didn't do it here. I'd come home, he'd be home for dinner, and he'd ask to go play with his friends. But what he was doing was actually going to a drug dealer. When he got in trouble, Michael always had this fight or flee. This one incident, the dope dealer was chasing him home. Probably he was getting chased because he owed the drug dealer some money. And he went and took his sister's .22 rifle. He stuck the rifle out the window, and he shot him. I thought if I took him away from this environment that things would smooth out. But it seemed like no matter what we say or what we did, somehow or another, it didn't get blocked into his head. I think it just went one ear and out the other. But as far as the anger issue, I took him to the doctors trying to find why he blows up like that. Everybody tried to pinpoint it, but nobody knew what was going on. And that's why I always told Michael, think before you do something. Just turn around and walk away. But he don't listen, and that's why this last incident with the knife happened. When I found out the person that Michael knifed had died, I was thinking, This is something I can't get him out of. I don't know why he was that angry. I don't think it ever stuck in his brain to think about something or the consequences of doing it before he did it.
When we get these cases, they're always tragic. There should have been different ways to handle a dispute than this, but now it's happened and someone is dead. My name is John W. Larson. I'm a district judge in Montana, and I presided over the case of Michael Hiley. Prison is generally a last resort. We have to give them a chance to change their life. You're not thrown back in jail for every violation. But Hiley was given a lot of chances, and chances can't be unending. Mr. Hiley did have sufficient opportunities to change, but he had these violent tendencies. And in the end, someone was stabbed to death. And when there's such violence, we have to make sure that everybody else is protected. The sentence in Hiley's case is one that is appropriate. It had enough punishment, but it wasn't extreme. It had a component for rehabilitation. There was a requirement that before he be considered for parole, he complete rehabilitative programs both in chemical dependency and mental health. So Hiley needs to take advantage of his sentence and utilize these chances to change.
The first few years in prison were really tough for me. I shut down mentally. I didn't want to think about what got me here, and that was pretty much what I did for my first few years. But I had gotten to a point where I was trying to make changes in my life, and listening to gay individuals try to explain how things are so much different in the world now and how things are so much more accepted. It was 2016 that I came out as being transgender. And mentally, I have never looked back. And it's helped me move forward from where I was back in 1999. I should have faced it a long time ago, but an individual had to die, and I had to be sent to prison for pretty close to the rest of my life for me to realize that facing the world the way I did, it wasn't a life I should have lived. And it had me reviewing everything that I have ever done in my life. It helped me realize that I shouldn't have been ashamed of who I was. I started wearing women's clothes at a really young age. It was right around the time that my father had left. I did a lot to try and suppress it because the way society looked at people that were transgender back in them days wasn't remotely socially acceptable. And I had been caught a few times dressed up in women's underwear when I was in junior high school. They caught me in the boys' locker room wearing a teddy and my gym shorts around my ankles, and I was laughed at and made fun of, and yeah, it was traumatizing. I would have to say that trying to fit into a man's world while inside I felt different. I didn't process it very well. The way I dealt with it was by drinking all the time, trying to medicate myself to where I didn't think about it anymore, and being intoxicated to help deal with feeling so down on myself. So I kept drinking, kept getting high, and there was a lot of violence. But since I came out as being transgender, I've been the happiest I've ever been. I've been trying for parole because my thirst for rehabilitation has never been so far to the forefront like it has been since I made the decision just to accept that this is who I am. My current name is Esdeath Antinua Hiley. You can like me or not. I've got to live with me, not you.
We received notifications that Michael Hiley wanted to change his name, and they told us what he wanted to change his name to. I had the lady on the phone spell it for me, and it was Easy, Deth. And I said, Easy Death? I was shocked. That's kind of a slap in the face to a victim's family where that's what it looks like, that's what his name is. Eventually, when they told us Hiley wants to transition as much as you can in prison, I don't know. It's a lot to deal with and to try and understand. And I'm sure it is for him internally, for what he's feeling. Paul was hilarious growing up, a little prankster. We always had to watch what he was doing so we didn't get in trouble and join in the shenanigans. He was just fun to have around, a good brother. In the late 90s, Paul was living in Missoula, and he met his girlfriend, Tracy, in about 97, and then they went on to have twin baby girls, and they were born in 1999. He was really excited about being a dad. I think it's unfortunate that he had to pass away and didn't even get that chance. I'm not really sure why Hailey thought that he should stab my brother, but they ended up getting into an argument about the bike. Paul told his friend, put that in the back of your truck, and it'll be funny to see him say, where's my bike? You know, it was just a simple joke that went wrong. I think that's pretty severe anger issues that you have if you want to stab somebody over a bicycle that wasn't even stolen. Hailey has been up for parole multiple times. But I feel that when you take somebody's life, that you should spend the remainder of your life incarcerated. At the last parole hearing via video, Hailey said that he felt like he was a woman, and maybe that's where some of his anger or rage came from. It's hard to say what you feel about that. I mean, I feel for people that feel that way anyways in their life. But he killed somebody violently, and it doesn't make it go away because your name changes.
There's a lot more going on contributing to Esteth's behavior than just her gender identity. I think it provides context for some of the things that she was going through and some of the things that she was struggling with. But the vast majority of people with gender identity issues do not commit murder. My name is Laura Kirsch. I'm a clinical forensic psychologist in Montana, and I primarily evaluate criminal defendants for the Montana judicial system. Human behavior is very hard to parse apart. Why anyone does anything is an interaction of so many variables that are internal to a person and then external as part of a situation. I think a large driver of her behavior at that time seems like anger, substance use, and antisocial personality traits. Is some of that due to her gender identity? Probably. But being able to draw a straight line from her gender identity to the murder, I think would be highly impossible to do. Based on the information that I've read, it sounds like she had a pretty antisocial and delinquent childhood. And I think when you have someone who perhaps doesn't start out with a whole lot of great emotion regulation capacity, and they're raised in an environment where they don't get the extra assistance that they need with it, that could certainly lead to using violence as a means to solve problems or as a means to express herself. But I don't think they provide an excuse or a justification for her behavior.
Since I came out as being transgender, I've been the happiest I've ever been. It gave me a body high like nothing I have ever done before. The thing that made me decide to start facing my issue was remembering the contentment and freedom it caused me to feel every time I'd be in the basement wearing a dress and high heels. And I had decided I just don't care what people think anymore. But an individual had to die, and I had to be sent to prison for pretty close to the rest of my life for me to realize that facing the world the way I did, it wasn't a life I should have lived. My life should have been so much better.
One of the characteristics that's pretty consistent with antisocial personality is kind of a self-centeredness or self-absorption. And I thought it was striking in all of the material that she was very self-focused. So it's possible that a lot of her behavior was driven by antisocial personality traits. And I think it's striking how much she's focused on herself and how little she's spoken of the victims and the victim family. I think if Esdeath would like a better chance of getting paroled in the future, she needs to show genuine remorse for what she did. So part of her journey that she's on should incorporate really considering the impact of her behavior on her victim's family, on his young daughters who have faced significant obstacles growing up without a father. And it's not totally clear from what I've seen and heard that she recognizes that and understands that she was a major factor in their difficult childhood.
I have some pictures of my brother, Paul Harris. There's some in here that my niece, Madison, has never seen before. At the time of Paul's death, we didn't know what was going to happen with the girls. I was a single mom to a 5-year-old, and I wasn't sure, could I take 2 babies and all of a sudden have 3 kids and be a single mom? Now I think I should have just made it work. I think this is the first picture that I saw of you girls. Look at how tiny you are. And I don't even know who's who. Can you tell?
Yeah, you can tell that's Brianna because of her dark hair. After my dad passed away, my mom was in and out of the picture, and my twin sister and I were in and out of group homes for years because of what Michael Hiley did. I was surrounded by drug use, abuse, neglect, all those things growing up. I just remember thinking all the time, like, I would give anything to just have, like, a regular family. It does anger me that we didn't get that chance because of somebody else's choice. I definitely feel like if he was here, things would be different. But I'm just thankful for, the family that we do have. That they stepped in to help. Because, through everything that we went through as children, I think we're pretty okay. It doesn't matter to me if Michael Hiley has changed or not, whether he was suffering with a mental illness or a drug problem. I don't think there's any excuse for killing my father. They didn't give me very long to talk. It was just, why do you think he shouldn't be released early? And I just said, because he took my dad away from our family. I believe that he should serve the sentence that he was given for murder. Any and all future parole hearings, I will testify that Michael Hiley should not be released early.
It feels terrible. Somebody calls and tells you your son is dead. You know, every mother's fear is losing their children. But I have forgiven Hiley. You can't keep holding on to things like that because they hurt you more than anybody else. I'm Cheryl, and I'm Paul Harris's mother. I always run the scenario through my mind about, well, what if Paul wouldn't have moved his bike? Would he still be here? If it wasn't for that one little thing. I mean, there's all these parameters that we can bring in and try to make sense of something that happened. But trust me when I tell you, I've gone through 10,000 of those, and they don't help. Nothing that I could say or do would bring my son back. Nothing. So I decided that I was going to forgive him. And I wanted to at least give him a chance that he could change. I asked about having Michael's sentence reduced. I didn't want to punish him, just lock him in a corner and leave him there forever. I asked if he was going to be getting any training. I was trying to find a good side to him being in prison and taking different classes and whatnot would help him. I am glad that Michael Hiley is changing. I think he is learning the hard way, but he is coming to terms with being transgender. And I think it's hard for him being in prison and trying to find those changes and those answers. I hope he gets out of prison and can live a life that everybody deserves. I would like the best to happen to him that could, but he also has to do some of it too.
Thanksgiving night of 1999 has taken me a really long time, but that's not who I am anymore. Transitioning has helped me maintain my thoughts of rehabilitation because it gives me something to strive for. I'm steps away from being the person that I've always wanted to be. I am a woman trapped inside of a man's body. I am not this Michael Hiley. My name is Esdeath.
Hiley has been up for parole multiple times, but I feel that when you take somebody's life, that you should spend the remainder of your life incarcerated. When they told us what he wanted to change his name to, I had the lady on the phone spell it for me, and it was Easy, D-E-T-H. And I said, Easy Death? I was shocked. That's kind of a slap in the face to a victim's family where that's what it looks like, that's what his name is.
I'm sorry that she sees it that way. And I really do hope that she will be open-minded enough to give me the opportunity to prove that it is not intended as a slap in the face to any of her family. When I came up with the name, it was a made-up character in a role-playing game that had qualities that I appreciated. She would always try to deal with situations in a communicative way, and she always tried to find balance. It's not supposed to mean anything to anybody else but me.
I think what comes across in everything that I've read and seen about as death is that she's got a number of antisocial personality traits. And one of the characteristics that's pretty consistent with antisocial personality is kind of a self-centeredness or self-absorption. I think it's striking how little she's spoken of the victims and the victim family. And it's not totally clear from what I've seen and heard that she recognizes that and understands that she was a major factor in the daughter's difficult childhood.
How do you say I'm sorry for taking away someone's loved one? How do you say you're sorry? Maybe that's something I need to do, is learn the fancy words that people will accept. I regret the fact that they had to grow up without their dad. But to me, actions do speak louder than words. 25 years ago, I was a drunken, addicted jackass. Everything was about me. That's not who I am anymore. It's your actions that have to prove that you learn, that you're trying to change. You know, I would like for my victim's family to find peace in this atrocity that I have caused. I want the few remaining family members that I have to find peace out of all this bullshit. And nobody else is going to find it until I do. And I am doing my best. That's what I want my actions to show.
It began with an ordinary walk that should have lasted only a few minutes. A little girl left her home on a quiet autumn afternoon carrying nothing more than the excitement of running a simple errand. She never returned. Within hours, an entire Canadian community was searching its fields, forests, and roadsides. Within days, fear had replaced hope. Within weeks, investigators realized they were no longer looking for a missing child. They were hunting a killer. What followed would become one of Canada's most haunting murder investigations, a case that would expose both the strengths and failures of modern criminal justice. For 31 years, the truth remained buried beneath unanswered questions, disputed evidence, public outrage, and one of the country's most controversial wrongful convictions. Then, decades later, a scientific breakthrough that did not even exist when the crime occurred would quietly rewrite everything investigators believed they knew. October 3rd, Sill, 1984. Queensville was a small rural community in Ontario, Canada, where quiet roads cut through farmland and neighbors recognized nearly every passing vehicle. It was the kind of place where parents often allowed their children a degree of independence that would seem unimaginable today. 8-year-old Christine Jessup lived there with her family. She was energetic, curious, and known for her bright smile. Like many children her age, she enjoyed simple routines, helping her family and playing outdoors in a community that felt safe. Yet that Wednesday afternoon appeared completely ordinary. Christine's mother asked her to walk to a nearby store to pick up a few household items. The trip was short. The route was familiar. She had made similar walks before. There was no reason to believe anything dangerous waited along the road. Sometime during the afternoon, Christine left home. Witnesses later reported seeing her walking along the roadside carrying money for the purchase. Then she disappeared. When she failed to return home, concern quickly turned into panic. Her family searched the immediate area. Neighbors joined them, and friends began checking nearby roads and fields. As daylight faded, the search expanded rapidly. Police were notified. Officers arrived expecting they might locate a child who had become temporarily lost or delayed. Instead, they encountered a mystery that would consume investigators for decades. The first hours of a missing child investigation are often the most critical. Officers moved quickly. Search teams spread across surrounding farmland. Volunteers combed wooded areas. Roadblocks were established. Every possible location where Christine might have wandered received immediate attention. Dogs searched for scent trails. Helicopters surveyed the countryside. Police interviewed residents throughout Queensville and neighboring communities. Every passing hour increased concern. Nothing suggested Christine had simply become lost. No witness reported seeing her return home. No obvious accident had occurred. No confirmed sightings emerged after the initial reports placing her along the road. The investigation entered an increasingly troubling phase. Investigators now considered the possibility of an abduction. During the early stages of the search, police worked under extraordinary pressure. Whenever a child disappears without explanation, investigators must simultaneously pursue multiple possibilities: a voluntary disappearance, an accident, a family dispute, an abduction. Every minute matters. Every incorrect assumption risks losing valuable evidence. Detectives interviewed everyone who might have crossed Christine's path that afternoon: motorists, store employees, nearby residents, construction workers, delivery drivers, farmers. Anyone who had traveled the roads surrounding Queensville became a potential witness. Dozens of tips arrived almost immediately. Some appeared promising. Others contradicted one another. Many proved impossible to verify. The search continued through changing weather conditions. Television stations interrupted programming with updates. Newspapers published Christine's photograph across Ontario. Her smiling face appeared on missing person posters distributed throughout the province. The story spread quickly beyond Queensville. Parents watched the news with growing anxiety. Schools discussed safety precautions. Communities across Canada followed the investigation closely. As days passed, hope gradually weakened. Search teams expanded farther from the original disappearance site. Investigators reviewed every reported sighting. Ground searches covered enormous areas. Still nothing. No clothing. No personal belongings. And no confirmed evidence indicating where Christine had gone. For investigators, the absence of evidence became deeply troubling. Children rarely vanish completely. Even accidental deaths usually leave some trace. A bicycle, footprints, discarded possessions, and witnesses. Here, there was almost nothing. The silence surrounding Christine's disappearance became its own mystery. Every day without answers increased pressure on investigators. Police established dedicated investigative teams. Hundreds of interviews accumulated. Maps covered office walls. Colored pins marked reported sightings. Timelines expanded as detectives attempted to reconstruct every minute of Christine's final known movements. Each lead generated another series of interviews. Each interview produced additional names. The investigation grew larger while the answers remained frustratingly distant. Then, on December 31st, SIL 1984, nearly 3 months after Christine disappeared, everything changed. A man walking through a wooded area near Sunderland, Ontario, made a horrifying discovery. Hidden among the trees were the remains of a child. Police immediately secured the area. Forensic specialists documented every detail before removing the remains. Dental records confirmed investigators' worst fears. The child was Christine Jessup. The missing person investigation officially became a homicide investigation. News of the discovery devastated the country. Families who had continued hoping for Christine's safe return suddenly confronted the tragic reality. The optimism that had sustained volunteers through weeks of searching disappeared overnight. Now investigators faced an entirely different challenge: finding whoever had murdered an 8-year-old girl. The crime scene raised immediate questions. Christine's body had been transported away from the location where she disappeared. The wooded area where she was found appeared to be a disposal site rather than the place where the murder had occurred. That distinction complicated the investigation enormously. Primary crime scenes often contain valuable forensic evidence. Secondary locations may reveal far less. Investigators carefully documented tire impressions, vegetation, soil, fibers, any biological evidence capable of identifying the offender. Forensic science in 1984 possessed important capabilities but remained far less advanced than laboratories today. DNA profiling had not yet become available in Canadian criminal investigations. Investigators therefore depended heavily upon physical evidence, witness testimony, timelines, and conventional forensic examinations. The autopsy established that Christine had been the victim of a violent homicide. Certain details were intentionally withheld from the public. Experienced homicide investigators frequently protect specific information known only to the offender and law enforcement. These undisclosed facts later become important when evaluating confessions or testing the credibility of witnesses. As investigators reconstructed Christine's final day, one conclusion became increasingly clear. Whoever abducted her likely acted quickly. The offender appeared familiar enough with the rural landscape to move without attracting immediate suspicion. He had successfully removed a child from a roadside during daylight hours. He had left remarkably little evidence behind. That combination suggested planning, confidence, or opportunity, or perhaps all three. Public fear intensified dramatically. Parents throughout Ontario altered daily routines. Children who had previously walked alone to school or neighborhood stores were now accompanied by adults. Communities organized safety meetings. Schools invited police officers to discuss stranger awareness. Queensville itself changed almost overnight. A place once defined by trust now lived beneath the shadow of uncertainty. Investigators faced mounting pressure from every direction. The media demanded progress. The public demanded arrests. Christine's family desperately needed answers. Every new lead received immediate attention. Anonymous callers contacted police. Psychics offered theories. People reported suspicious strangers. Old neighborhood disputes resurfaced. Rumors spread rapidly through surrounding communities. Sorting credible information from speculation became one of the investigation's greatest challenges. Large homicide investigations often generate thousands of tips. Most prove irrelevant. Some consume enormous investigative resources before reaching dead ends. Detectives cannot ignore any possibility during the early stages. Every lead must be documented. Every witness interviewed. Every allegation evaluated. The Jessup investigation quickly expanded into one of the largest homicide inquiries Ontario had ever undertaken. Months passed. No arrest. Investigators developed persons of interest. Each underwent extensive examination. Some provided alibis. Others failed polygraph examinations. Several remained under suspicion for varying periods. Yet none could be conclusively linked to the crime. Without definitive forensic evidence, detectives relied heavily upon circumstantial information. That approach inevitably created uncertainty. As public frustration grew, so did pressure upon investigators to identify a suspect. The emotional weight of the investigation affected everyone involved. Experienced detectives later described the case as one that lingered long after working hours ended. Many had children close to Christine's age. Every interview, every photograph, every piece of evidence carried enormous emotional significance. The desire to solve the case became deeply personal, but determination alone cannot create evidence. Investigators needed facts, and the facts remained painfully incomplete. Unknown to everyone involved, the answers already existed. Not inside witness statements. Not inside anonymous tips. Not inside the countless rumors circulating across Ontario. The truth had been left behind by the killer himself. Tiny biological traces collected and preserved during the original investigation contained the identity of the offender. In 1984, however, no laboratory possessed the scientific ability to read that identity. The evidence would remain silent. Not for months, not for years, but for more than 3 decades. During that time, the investigation would take dramatic and deeply controversial turns, leading detectives toward conclusions that would later collapse under scientific scrutiny. Innocent lives would be forever altered. Public confidence would be shaken. The Jessup case would become one of Canada's most debated criminal investigations, not only because of the murder itself, but because the search for justice would reveal how easily certainty can be mistaken for truth when science has not yet caught up with the evidence waiting quietly inside an evidence locker. The discovery of Christine Jessup's body transformed a desperate missing person search into one of the largest homicide investigations in Canadian history. The urgency that had defined the first 3 months did not disappear. It intensified. Detectives were no longer racing against time to save a child's life. They were racing to identify a killer before evidence disappeared, memories faded, and fear consumed an entire province. Every hour after the recovery of Christine's remains carried enormous importance. Investigators returned to the original disappearance site, the wooded area where her body had been found, and every roadway connecting the two. Maps covered conference room walls. Colored markers identified witness sightings. Vehicles that had traveled through Queensville on October 3, SIL 1984, were reconstructed one by one. Detectives began asking a question that would dominate the investigation for years. Who had the opportunity to take an 8-year-old child from a quiet rural road in broad daylight without attracting immediate attention? The answer refused to appear. Crime scene specialists carefully documented the wooded area near Sunderland where Christine had been discovered. Although the location contained valuable physical evidence, investigators quickly reached an important conclusion. This was almost certainly not where she had been murdered. Several factors supported that assessment. The positioning of the remains, the surrounding environment, the absence of signs suggesting a prolonged struggle. Detectives believed someone had transported Christine's body to the location after the homicide. That realization significantly complicated the investigation. Instead of one crime scene, investigators now faced at least 2. The place where Christine disappeared, the place where she was killed, the place where her body had been abandoned. Finding all 3 became an enormous challenge. Without knowing the primary crime scene, investigators lacked access to potentially crucial evidence. Blood patterns, fibers, fingerprints, tool marks, a trace material. Any of these could have dramatically narrowed the list of suspects. Instead, detectives were forced to build their case using fragments gathered across multiple locations. Hundreds of officers participated in the expanding investigation. Search teams examined gravel pits, drainage ditches, abandoned buildings, farm structures, woodlots, creeks, fields stretching for kilometers around Queensville and Sunderland. Every location capable of concealing evidence received attention. Some searches lasted days. Others produced nothing. Still, the investigation continued. The public response remained extraordinary. Volunteers donated thousands of hours assisting police. Telephone tip lines operated continuously. Media organizations published updates almost daily. Christine's photograph became one of the most recognizable images in Canada during the final months of 1984. Every new development generated another wave of hope. Every disappointment deepened public frustration. Investigators interviewed family members repeatedly. This is standard procedure in every major homicide investigation. Detectives must eliminate every possibility regardless of emotional difficulty. Parents, relatives, friends, neighbors, ventures. Anyone connected to the victim receives careful scrutiny. Nothing during those interviews suggested family involvement. Attention gradually shifted outward. Police developed extensive timelines identifying everyone known to have traveled through Queensville during the afternoon of October 3rd. Construction crews, delivery drivers, postal workers, utility employees, traveling salespeople, residents returning from work, farm workers operating machinery near roadways. Every individual represented either a possible witness or a potential suspect. Thousands of investigative hours disappeared into these interviews. Many seemed promising. Few produced meaningful results. The investigation gradually expanded beyond Ontario. Tips arrived from other provinces. Some callers claimed they had seen Christine alive after her disappearance. Others reported suspicious strangers passing through rural communities. Several described vehicles that could never be conclusively identified. Every report required investigation. Every lead consumed valuable resources. It most ultimately reached dead ends. Forensic specialists continued analyzing every piece of physical evidence recovered during the investigation. Hair samples, fibers, clothing, soil comparisons, tire impressions, biological material. In 1984, forensic laboratories possessed sophisticated techniques for the era, yet investigators remained limited by available science. DNA profiling was still in its infancy. It had not become an operational tool for Canadian homicide investigations. The biological evidence collected from Christine's body therefore remained largely silent. Laboratories could preserve it. They could document it. They could not yet identify the person who left it. That scientific limitation would shape the next 3 decades. Meanwhile, behavioral analysts began developing offender profiles. Although criminal profiling cannot identify a specific individual, it helps investigators prioritize suspects by examining crime scene characteristics. The offender likely knew rural roads. He demonstrated enough confidence to abduct a child during daylight. He successfully avoided immediate detection. They transported the victim after the homicide. He left remarkably little physical evidence capable of identifying him through conventional investigative methods. These observations suggested someone familiar with the region. Someone comfortable operating without attracting attention. Someone capable of blending into ordinary life. Public fear continued growing. Parents stopped allowing children to walk alone. Schools revised safety procedures. Neighborhood watch groups formed across communities that had previously considered violent crime almost unimaginable. The murder of one child had fundamentally altered daily life throughout much of southern Ontario. Investigators understood that solving the case carried significance beyond one family. The entire community needed reassurance that the offender had been identified. Pressure increased with every passing month. Large homicide investigations often reach a difficult stage after initial evidence collection ends. The obvious witnesses have already been interviewed. Crime scenes have been processed repeatedly. Laboratory examinations continue but produce few breakthroughs. Investigators begin revisiting earlier assumptions, hoping overlooked details may reveal new directions. The Jessup investigation entered exactly that phase. Detectives reconstructed Christine's final known movements minute by minute. Witnesses described seeing her walking toward the local store. Some remembered clothing. Others recalled the weather. A few believed they had seen unfamiliar vehicles. Memory, however, is imperfect. As weeks passed, witness accounts became increasingly difficult to verify. Human recollection naturally changes over time. Investigators had to separate reliable observations from honest mistakes. Rumors complicated matters further. Entire communities speculated about possible suspects. Individuals behaving oddly suddenly attracted suspicion. Old personal disputes resurfaced. Anonymous accusations flooded investigators. As some named innocent neighbors. Others pointed toward complete strangers. Experienced detectives understood the danger. Public fear often generates false certainty. Evidence, not rumor, must guide a homicide investigation. Yet evidence remained frustratingly limited. One challenge repeatedly confronted investigators. The offender appeared to have committed remarkably few observable mistakes. No reliable eyewitness identified the abduction. No murder weapon was recovered. No definitive fingerprints connected a suspect to the crime. No confession emerged. Every investigative strategy encountered the same obstacle: insufficient proof. Detectives refused to surrender. New task forces reviewed existing files. Fresh investigators questioned earlier conclusions. Outside experts examined forensic evidence. The investigation expanded rather than contracted. By this stage, thousands of pages of reports documented nearly every conceivable lead. Despite extraordinary effort, the central question remained unchanged. Who killed Christine Jessup? Unknown to everyone involved, the answer remained locked inside evidence already collected. Science simply lacked the ability to unlock it. This distinction would become one of the most important lessons in Canadian criminal justice history. The investigation had not failed to preserve evidence. Quite the opposite. Investigators had collected extraordinarily important biological material. Its significance simply exceeded contemporary scientific capability. Years later, those preserved samples would become the foundation upon which the entire case would be reconstructed. But in the mid-1980s, detectives had no way of knowing that. Instead, they continued relying upon conventional investigative methods. Gradually, attention began focusing upon individuals living within Christine's broader community. Some had previous criminal histories. Others displayed unusual behavior. A few generated repeated anonymous tips. Each became the subject of increasingly detailed investigation. One name in particular would soon rise above all others. The evidence appeared persuasive. Witnesses raised concerns. Investigators believed patterns were emerging. Public pressure demanded progress. What happened next would fundamentally change the course of the investigation and eventually become one of the most controversial chapters in Canadian legal history. A suspect would be identified. An arrest would be celebrated. Many people would believe the mystery had finally been solved. But the evidence supporting that conclusion would ultimately collapse decades later, revealing a painful truth that no one involved in the original investigation could yet imagine. The real killer was still free, living an ordinary life, completely unknown to police, waiting silently while an innocent man became the center of one of Canada's most famous murder prosecutions. As the months following Christine Jessup's murder turned into years, investigators found themselves confronting one of the most difficult realities in homicide work. The initial surge of information had slowed. Thousands of interviews had been completed. Crime scenes had been processed repeatedly. Physical evidence had been cataloged and preserved. Yet the identity of the person responsible remained unknown. Every detective assigned to the case understood the growing pressure. An 8-year-old girl had been abducted and murdered in rural Ontario. The public expected answers. Christine's family deserved justice. The longer the investigation continued without an arrest, the more intense the scrutiny became. Police continued reviewing the growing list of potential suspects. Every person with any conceivable connection to Christine's final movements received attention. Some were eliminated through verified alibis. Others remained under observation for extended periods. Anonymous tips continued arriving. Many named neighbors. Some accused relatives. Others focused on complete strangers seen driving unfamiliar vehicles through Queensville during the afternoon of October 3, 1984. Most reports ultimately proved unreliable. Fear has a powerful effect on memory. Communities traumatized by violent crime often begin searching for explanations long before evidence can provide them. Investigators understood this. But they also knew that among hundreds of inaccurate tips, one genuine observation could still exist. Every lead required attention. Every allegation demanded verification. As the investigation expanded, detectives began concentrating on individuals who had interacted with Christine's family before her disappearance. One name gradually appeared with increasing frequency: Guy Paul Morin. Morin lived relatively close to the Jessup family. He was quiet, reserved, socially awkward according to some acquaintances. His personality stood out in a small community where unusual behavior often attracted attention. Investigators interviewed him during the early stages of the inquiry. Like many others connected to the neighborhood, he voluntarily answered questions. Initially, nothing conclusively linked him to the murder. Yet as months passed, suspicion slowly intensified. Several factors contributed to this shift. Witness recollections appeared to place him within the broader area. Some statements suggested behavior investigators considered unusual. Others described observations that seemed inconsistent with his explanations. Viewed independently, none of these details established guilt. Viewed collectively, detectives increasingly believed they warranted closer examination. This is one of the greatest challenges in major criminal investigations. Human beings naturally search for patterns. Sometimes those patterns reveal the truth. Sometimes they create an illusion of certainty. Investigators, operating under enormous pressure, must constantly distinguish between the two. Throughout the late 1980s, attention toward Morin continued growing. Police conducted additional interviews. Search warrants were executed. Forensic evidence available at the time underwent repeated analysis. Detectives attempted to compare physical findings against investigative theories. Some results appeared supportive. Others remained inconclusive. Public speculation accelerated. Media coverage intensified. The case had become one of Canada's most closely watched murder investigations. Every development received national attention. As suspicion increased, Moran's life changed dramatically. Friends noticed growing isolation. Neighbors discussed rumors openly. News reports repeatedly mentioned his name. Even before formal charges, public perception began shifting. Many people assumed investigators must possess compelling evidence. After all, why would police devote such extraordinary attention to one individual without substantial justification? That assumption would later prove deeply significant. Because public confidence often follows investigative confidence. If detectives appear certain, communities frequently become certain as well. The investigation reached a critical turning point when forensic experts examined evidence using the scientific techniques available during the late 1980s. Several forms of forensic comparison existed before widespread DNA profiling: hair analysis, fiber comparison, blood typing, serology, microscopic examinations. These methods provided valuable investigative information. However, they generally lacked the definitive identifying power later achieved through DNA technology. At the time, investigators interpreted certain forensic findings as consistent with their developing theory. Combined with witness testimony and circumstantial evidence, confidence continued increasing. Eventually, prosecutors concluded they possessed sufficient grounds to proceed. In 1989, nearly 5 years after Christine's murder, Guy Paul Morin was charged with first-degree murder. The announcement dominated headlines across Canada. For many members of the public, relief arrived immediately. After years of uncertainty, authorities appeared to have identified the person responsible. Christine's family hoped the long search for justice might finally be approaching its conclusion. The criminal proceedings that followed became extraordinarily complex. Defense attorneys challenged the reliability of witness testimony. They questioned forensic interpretations. They argued that investigators had developed tunnel vision by focusing too narrowly upon one suspect while alternative possibilities remained insufficiently explored. Prosecutors maintained that the cumulative weight of the evidence supported conviction. The trial became a national event. Journalists filled the courtroom. Legal experts analyzed testimony daily. Public attention remained intense. The evidence presented reflected the investigative tools of the era: witness observations, behavioral interpretations, forensic examinations available before modern DNA analysis, circumstantial reconstruction. Each component contributed to the prosecution's theory, yet each also contained limitations that would later become increasingly apparent. The legal process itself became lengthy and complicated. Court proceedings generated extensive debate regarding evidentiary standards. Appeals followed. New hearings emerged. Legal arguments continued evolving as scientific understanding advanced. Throughout this period, the murder of Christine Jessup remained one of Canada's most discussed criminal cases. Many believed the investigation had succeeded. Others questioned whether uncertainty still existed beneath the apparent confidence. Meanwhile, forensic science itself continued changing. During the late 1980s and early 1990s, DNA profiling began demonstrating extraordinary potential within criminal investigations worldwide. Cases previously dependent upon circumstantial evidence suddenly acquired opportunities for far more precise biological comparison. Canadian investigators observed these developments closely. The implications were profound. Evidence collected years earlier might now answer questions impossible to resolve when originally examined. Christine's case possessed exactly that kind of preserved evidence. Carefully stored biological material remained available, initially collected using the best practices of 1984, protected through years of legal proceedings. Waiting. At first, relatively few people appreciated what this meant. DNA technology remained new. Laboratories required extensive validation before courts fully accepted results. Testing procedures continued improving rapidly. Scientific confidence expanded with every successful application. As these advances accelerated, legal experts began asking an uncomfortable question. What if older convictions based primarily upon circumstantial evidence deserved renewed examination? The question carried enormous consequences, not only for Guy Paul Moran, but for every criminal case decided before modern forensic genetics. Eventually, new DNA testing was authorized in the Jessup investigation. Scientists approached the preserved biological evidence with techniques unavailable during the original investigation. Unlike earlier forensic methods, DNA analysis possessed the capacity to identify or exclude individuals with remarkable precision. The expectations surrounding the testing were enormous. Many believed the results would finally eliminate remaining controversy. They were correct, just not in the way anyone expected. When laboratory analysis concluded, the findings delivered a stunning result. The DNA recovered from Christine Jessup's body did not belong to Guy Paul Moran. The evidence excluded him completely. The implications were immediate and devastating. If the biological evidence originated from the offender, and it excluded the convicted man, then investigators had convicted the wrong person. The realization sent shockwaves throughout Canada's criminal justice system. Years of investigative certainty suddenly collapsed beneath the weight of scientific evidence. Everything had to be reconsidered. The investigation, the prosecution, the conviction, the assumptions, the evidence. Most importantly, one unavoidable conclusion emerged. The real killer had never been caught. While an innocent man endured years under suspicion, prosecution, imprisonment, and public condemnation, the person responsible for Christine Jessup's murder remained unidentified, living somewhere beyond the reach of investigators. Completely unaware that the very biological evidence left behind in 1984 would one day expose him. Science had corrected one profound injustice, but another remained unresolved. Christine's murderer was still free, and the investigation, once believed finished, had suddenly begun all over again. The DNA results did more than overturn a conviction. They forced Canada to confront one of the most profound failures in its criminal justice history. For years, the investigation into Christine Jessup's murder had been presented as a solved case. Court proceedings had unfolded. Appeals had been argued. Public opinion had largely settled around the belief that the right man had been identified. Then, in a matter of scientific certainty, that entire foundation collapsed. The biological evidence preserved from 1984 excluded Guy Paul Moran completely. There was no ambiguity, no alternative interpretation. The DNA belonged to someone else. The consequences were immediate. Moran's conviction was overturned. His name was eventually cleared. Years of suspicion, years of legal battles, years of public scrutiny, all traced back to an investigation that had become increasingly focused on one suspect while the actual offender remained unidentified. The case became a national reckoning. Legal scholars examined every stage of the investigation. Former detectives reviewed investigative decisions. Forensic experts analyzed the limitations of pre-DNA science. Journalists revisited courtroom testimony. Public confidence in the criminal justice system faced difficult questions. How had such a profound error occurred? And the answer was neither simple nor comforting. The original investigators had worked tirelessly. Thousands of hours had been devoted to solving Christine's murder. The mistake did not arise from indifference. It emerged from a combination of investigative pressure, incomplete forensic technology, unreliable witness recollections, and growing confidence built upon circumstantial evidence rather than definitive scientific identification. The case illustrated one of the greatest dangers in complex criminal investigations: tunnel vision. Once investigators become convinced they have identified the correct suspect, every new piece of information risks being interpreted through that belief. Evidence appearing consistent receives greater attention. Evidence creating doubt may receive less emphasis. This phenomenon has been documented in investigations around the world. The Jessup case became one of Canada's most significant examples. Recognizing the importance of understanding what had happened, the Ontario government established a public inquiry. The commission examined the investigation in extraordinary detail. Thousands of pages of documents were reviewed. Police procedures, forensic practices, prosecutorial decisions, courtroom testimony. Every major stage of the investigation underwent careful analysis. The findings extended far beyond one individual case. The inquiry produced recommendations intended to improve homicide investigations across Canada. Investigators received additional guidance regarding evidence disclosure, witness reliability, forensic interpretation, major case management. Perhaps most importantly, the inquiry emphasized the need to remain open to alternative investigative possibilities even after a primary suspect has been identified. The lessons reached police agencies throughout the country. Meanwhile, Christine Jessup's murder was officially unsolved once again. The emotional impact upon Christine's family proved difficult to describe. After believing for years that justice had been achieved, they now faced the painful reality that the person responsible had never been identified. The investigation had returned to the beginning. Except now, decades had passed. Witness memories had faded. Some participants had died. Communities had changed. Physical locations no longer appeared as they had in 1984. Many investigators originally assigned to the case had retired. Yet one critical advantage remained: the biological evidence. Unlike human memory, DNA does not fade with time when properly preserved. The same samples collected during the original investigation remained secured under appropriate forensic conditions. They had already corrected one miscarriage of justice. Perhaps someday they could identify the real killer. Throughout the late 1990s and early 2000s, investigators periodically reopened the file. Fresh detectives inherited thousands of investigative documents. Boxes containing reports, photographs, interview transcripts, laboratory records, maps, search logs, evidence inventories. Every new investigative team confronted the same daunting reality. They possessed an extraordinary amount of information. They still lacked one essential fact: the identity of the offender. DNA profiles obtained from biological evidence were entered into Canadian forensic databases. Investigators hoped the unknown profile might eventually match someone arrested for another violent crime. But years passed, and no match. Each time another offender entered the National DNA Database, laboratories automatically compared profiles. Still nothing. The unknown DNA remained exactly that: unknown. This outcome suggested several possibilities. Perhaps the offender had never been arrested for a qualifying offense. Perhaps he had died before DNA collection became routine. Perhaps he lived outside Canada. Or perhaps he had simply avoided criminal detection altogether. Every possibility remained open. Detectives refused to close the case. Cold case investigations differ fundamentally from active homicide investigations. Rather than responding to daily developments, investigators continually reevaluate preserved evidence whenever new technology becomes available. The Jessup case entered exactly this phase. Advances in forensic genetics continued accelerating. DNA analysis became increasingly sensitive. Laboratories required progressively smaller biological samples. Computational methods improved. International cooperation expanded. Every advancement offered renewed hope. Yet despite these improvements, one obstacle remained. Traditional DNA databases identify individuals already present within the system. If the offender had never submitted DNA through criminal justice procedures, conventional database searches could never identify him. The investigation once again reached a scientific limit. Public attention gradually diminished. New criminal cases dominated headlines. Younger generations grew up knowing Christine Jessup's name primarily as a famous wrongful conviction rather than an unsolved murder. Within police agencies, however, the case remained active. Evidence stayed preserved. Periodic reviews continued. Investigators monitored developments in forensic science closely. By the early 2010s, another revolutionary investigative technique began attracting international attention: investigative genetic genealogy. Unlike traditional forensic database searches, this emerging approach did not require the offender's DNA to exist inside criminal databases. Instead, investigators searched for biological relatives whose voluntarily submitted genetic information might provide clues regarding family relationships. The method had not yet achieved widespread recognition. Few people appreciated its potential. Among those paying close attention were experienced cold case investigators. They understood immediately what the technology represented. Not certainty, opportunity. If the unknown DNA profile from Christine Jessup's murder belonged to someone whose relatives had participated in consumer genealogy testing, investigators might finally possess a path toward identification. The concept appeared almost unbelievable. A killer who had successfully avoided police for decades might ultimately be identified not because he made a mistake, but because distant relatives became interested in tracing their ancestry. Science had once again expanded beyond previous limitations. The question now became whether preserved evidence from 1984 remained suitable for these remarkable new techniques. Laboratory specialists carefully evaluated the biological material. Advances in DNA sequencing now permitted far more detailed genetic analysis than investigators had imagined 30 years earlier. The evidence still existed. The technology finally had the capability to ask new questions. Not, is this DNA already inside a criminal database? But, whose family might this DNA belong to? It was a subtle difference. Yet it represented one of the greatest transformations in modern criminal investigation. After decades of searching for the offender directly, investigators would begin searching for his relatives instead. Somewhere inside an ordinary family tree, hidden among generations of births, marriages, and descendants, the identity of Christine Jessup's killer was waiting. The investigation that had once symbolized the limitations of forensic science was about to become one of its greatest triumphs. But before detectives could reveal the truth, they would need to reconstruct an entire family history from a single preserved DNA profile left behind on an October afternoon in 1984. For more than 3 decades, the evidence from Christine Jessup's murder remained preserved with extraordinary care. Locked inside secure forensic storage, the biological samples collected in 1984 outlived investigators, prosecutors, courtroom battles, and one of Canada's most significant wrongful conviction cases. During those years, forensic science advanced at a pace few people could have imagined. What had once been impossible gradually became routine. Laboratories learned to recover increasingly detailed genetic information from older evidence. Powerful computers transformed complex DNA analysis into practical investigative tools. Most importantly, an entirely new discipline began changing the future of cold case investigations around the world. Investigative genetic genealogy. The concept sounded almost unbelievable. Instead of asking whether an unknown DNA profile matched someone already arrested, investigators began asking a completely different question: who might be biologically related to the unknown person? The difference was revolutionary. Traditional DNA databases depend upon offenders already existing within the criminal justice system. Investigative genetic genealogy searches for family connections instead. Distant cousins, great-grandparents, shared ancestry, fragments of inherited DNA capable of pointing investigators toward entire family trees rather than single individuals. By the late 2010s, several high-profile homicide investigations had demonstrated the extraordinary potential of this method. Cases once considered permanently unsolved suddenly produced viable suspects after decades of silence. Cold case detectives throughout North America watched these developments with increasing interest. Among them were investigators responsible for Christine Jessup's murder. The case appeared uniquely suited for renewed forensic review. The biological evidence remained remarkably well preserved. Laboratory documentation was comprehensive. The unknown DNA profile was complete enough for advanced analysis. Most importantly, conventional investigative methods had reached their practical limits years earlier. If the case were ever to be solved, it would almost certainly require a fundamentally different approach. Investigators assembled specialists with expertise in forensic genetics, genealogy, and cold case investigation. Before any family trees could be constructed, scientists first needed to generate a detailed genetic profile suitable for genealogical comparison. This process differed from ordinary forensic DNA matching. Instead of focusing only upon the genetic markers traditionally used within criminal databases, laboratories analyzed far broader portions of the genome capable of revealing distant biological relationships. The work demanded extraordinary precision. Evidence collected decades earlier required careful handling. Quality control procedures became exceptionally rigorous. Every stage underwent repeated verification. The investigation had already experienced one devastating miscarriage of justice. No investigator intended to repeat history. Months of laboratory work eventually produced the necessary genetic profile. The next stage represented perhaps the most painstaking phase of the entire investigation: genealogical reconstruction. Contrary to popular imagination, investigative genetic genealogy does not immediately identify a suspect. It generates possibilities. Professional genealogists then begin reconstructing enormous family networks extending across multiple generations. Historical birth records, marriage certificates, death registrations, census documents, immigration records, military files, obituaries, newspaper archives. Every available historical source contributes another small piece of the puzzle. The process resembles assembling a massive family history, one documented relationship at a time. Detectives and genealogists worked side by side. Every biological connection required confirmation. Every branch of each family tree demanded verification. Mistakes at this stage could redirect the entire investigation toward innocent individuals. Accuracy remained essential. Gradually, separate family lines began converging. Individuals who appeared unrelated at first eventually connected through common ancestors. Generations of descendants spread across different provinces, different communities, even different countries. The family trees continued expanding, then narrowing, expanding again. With every verified relationship, investigators reduced the number of potential candidates. Age, sex, geographic history, residence in Ontario during 1984, opportunity. Each factor eliminated additional names. The investigation that had once contained thousands of possible suspects slowly contracted toward a much smaller group. Unlike the original investigation, this process unfolded almost entirely outside public view. No dramatic press conferences. No leaked suspect names. No speculation. Investigators remembered the painful consequences of earlier assumptions. This time, evidence would speak before conclusions did. As genealogical analysis progressed, detectives revisited archived investigative files. Names overlooked decades earlier received fresh attention. Addresses were compared against historical maps. Employment records were examined. Vehicle ownership was reviewed. Old witness statements acquired entirely new significance when viewed through the framework created by genetic genealogy. The past itself began reorganizing. Facts that once appeared unrelated suddenly connected. Patterns invisible in the 1980s became increasingly clear. The investigation advanced steadily but cautiously. Professional genealogists repeatedly emphasized that family relationships alone never establish guilt. Genealogy identifies investigative leads. Nothing more. Traditional police work remains essential. Surveillance. Background investigations. DNA confirmation. Every conventional investigative safeguard still applies. The genealogical evidence pointed detectives toward one particular individual, a man who had lived in Ontario during the relevant period. Someone whose age, geographic history, and family relationships aligned with the developing investigation. His name had appeared during earlier investigative reviews, but never as the central focus. Now the scientific evidence suggested investigators should look much more closely. Unlike previous decades, detectives resisted any temptation to move quickly. The history of the Jessup investigation demanded patience. Before confronting anyone, investigators needed independent confirmation. Surveillance operations quietly began. Officers observed ordinary daily routines. The objective was simple: obtain a discarded DNA sample legally without alerting the individual under investigation. This strategy has become common in modern homicide investigations. People routinely discard items containing biological material: a drinking cup, a cigarette, a tissue. Once abandoned, such items may lawfully provide investigators with DNA suitable for forensic comparison, subject to applicable legal procedures. The surveillance required discipline. Investigators avoided unnecessary attention. No public announcements were made. No arrests occurred. Everything depended upon laboratory confirmation. Eventually, detectives recovered a discarded item believed to contain the suspect's DNA. Yet the sample was transported under strict chain of custody procedures. Forensic scientists prepared for one of the most important comparisons in Canadian criminal justice history. On one side stood biological evidence collected from Christine Jessup's body in 1984. On the other stood DNA recovered from the contemporary discarded sample. More than 30 years separated those two pieces of evidence. Everything now depended upon whether science could connect them. Laboratory analysts conducted the comparison according to rigorous forensic standards. Every stage underwent verification. Independent review ensured accuracy. No shortcuts. No assumptions. Only science. When the analysis concluded, investigators received the answer they had pursued for more than 3 decades. The DNA profiles matched. The unknown biological evidence preserved since 1984 finally belonged to a real person. The scientific certainty investigators had lacked throughout the original investigation now existed, not through witness memory, not through speculation, not through circumstantial reconstruction, through direct forensic identification. The implications were enormous. For the first time since Christine disappeared on that October afternoon, investigators knew whose biological evidence had been left behind. Yet one final responsibility remained. Scientific identification alone did not conclude the investigation. Detectives still needed to reconstruct the suspect's connection to the crime, review every available historical record, consult prosecutors, and ensure that every investigative step satisfied modern legal standards. Only then could Canada finally learn the identity of the man who had remained hidden behind an unknown DNA profile for more than 31 years. The evidence had remained patient. Science had finally caught up, and the investigation that had begun with the disappearance of an 8-year-old girl in rural Ontario was about to enter the final chapter that investigators in 1984 could never have imagined. The DNA comparison ended 31 years of uncertainty in a single laboratory report. For decades, investigators had referred to the unknown offender only through evidence numbers, forensic files, and an unidentified genetic profile preserved from the original investigation. Now that profile belonged to a real individual. The breakthrough did not arrive through chance, a late confession, or an overlooked eyewitness. It came through the careful preservation of biological evidence and the emergence of investigative genetic genealogy, a scientific discipline that had not existed when Christine Jessup disappeared in October 1984. Yet even after the DNA match, detectives understood that identifying the source of the biological evidence represented only one stage of the investigation. Every conclusion still required meticulous verification before the case could be presented publicly. The name emerging from the investigation was Calvin Hoover. For many Canadians, it was an unfamiliar name. Unlike individuals who had previously attracted public suspicion, Hoover had lived almost entirely outside the national spotlight. He had never been charged in connection with Christine's murder. He had never stood trial. For decades, his name had remained largely absent from public discussion surrounding the case. That fact alone immediately distinguished this phase of the investigation from everything that had come before. Detectives began reconstructing Hoover's life with extraordinary care. Historical records confirmed that he had lived in Ontario during the period of Christine's disappearance. Investigators reviewed employment information, residential history, family relationships, vehicle ownership, daily routines. Every available document capable of establishing his movements and circumstances during 1984 received renewed attention. Unlike the original investigation, detectives now possessed an objective starting point. The DNA had identified the individual. The remaining investigation sought to understand how that individual fit into the broader chronology of the crime. As officers reviewed archived investigative material, an unexpected discovery emerged. Hoover's name was not entirely absent from the original investigation. He had appeared in police records during the early stages of the case. At the time, however, investigators had not developed sufficient evidence to identify him as the offender. Without modern DNA technology, his connection to the crime remained impossible to establish conclusively. Like many names reviewed during large homicide investigations, his gradually disappeared beneath thousands of pages of reports as attention shifted elsewhere. This realization proved both remarkable and sobering. The offender had not been invisible. He had existed within the investigative landscape from the beginning. Science simply lacked the ability to distinguish him from countless other possibilities. The renewed investigation also revealed another important fact. Calvin Hoover had died in 2015. 3 years before, investigators identified him through genetic genealogy. That reality fundamentally altered the legal outcome. There would be no arrest, no interrogation, no criminal trial, no courtroom testimony. The person identified as Christine Jessup's killer would never personally face prosecution. For Christine's family, the news carried deeply mixed emotions. After more than 3 decades, investigators finally knew who had murdered their daughter. Yet the opportunity for a criminal conviction had already disappeared. Justice had arrived in the form of truth rather than punishment. Detectives nevertheless continued their work. Professional investigations demand complete documentation regardless of whether prosecution remains possible. Investigators assembled every available piece of supporting evidence: historical timelines, witness interviews, geographic analysis, forensic findings, DNA reports, genealogical documentation. The objective remained unchanged: establish the facts according to the highest evidentiary standards. Authorities consulted forensic scientists repeatedly. Because the investigation involved groundbreaking genealogical methods, every conclusion required careful scientific explanation. The DNA comparison itself remained conventional forensic analysis. Genetic genealogy merely generated the investigative lead. The direct DNA comparison established the identification. This distinction proved critically important. Investigative genealogy does not replace forensic science. It guides investigators toward individuals requiring conventional forensic confirmation. Only after that confirmation did detectives conclude Hoover had been responsible. As investigators prepared public announcements, they also revisited the broader history of the case. Few Canadian homicide investigations had experienced such dramatic evolution. A child disappeared. An enormous search followed. The body was discovered months later. A lengthy investigation produced the wrongful conviction of an innocent man. DNA exonerated him. The murder returned to unsolved status. Decades later, preserved biological evidence identified a completely different offender through technology unavailable at the time of the crime. The chronology itself illustrated the extraordinary transformation of forensic science over one generation. In October 2020, Canadian authorities publicly announced their findings. They stated that DNA evidence identified Calvin Hoover as the individual responsible for Christine Jessup's murder. Investigators explained the role of forensic genealogy. They described the scientific process carefully. Officials emphasized that the conclusion rested upon DNA evidence recovered from Christine's body and confirmed through modern forensic analysis. The announcement represented one of the most significant developments in Canadian cold case history. For Christine's family, it ended decades of uncertainty. Although no legal sentence could now be imposed, they finally possessed an answer to the question that had haunted them since 1984. Who killed Christine? The investigation had finally provided that answer. The broader public reaction reflected both relief and reflection. Many Canadians remembered the case primarily because of Guy Paul Morin's wrongful conviction. Now they confronted the full scope of what had happened. 2 families had endured decades of unimaginable consequences. Christine's family lived with the loss of a child and years without knowing the truth. Morin lived beneath the weight of a crime he did not commit before scientific evidence ultimately restored his innocence. The investigation became a powerful reminder that justice requires both persistence and humility. Investigators must pursue every lead aggressively. At the same time, they must remain willing to reconsider earlier conclusions when new evidence emerges. The Jessup investigation demonstrated both principles with remarkable clarity. It also reinforced the extraordinary importance of evidence preservation. The biological material collected in 1984 survived because investigators recognized its potential value, even though contemporary science could not fully analyze it. Evidence technicians protected it. Laboratories maintained it. Chain of custody procedures preserved its integrity. Without those decisions, the genetic genealogy investigation decades later would have been impossible. One generation preserved the evidence. Another generation unlocked its meaning. Gold case investigators across North America studied the Jessup investigation closely, not because every case follows the same path, but because the investigation illustrated a fundamental truth. Scientific capability continually evolves. Evidence that appears exhausted today may become decisive tomorrow. The responsibility of investigators is therefore not merely to solve crimes with current technology. It is also to preserve opportunities for future science. The murder of Christine Jessup ultimately became much more than a tragic homicide investigation. It became a defining case in Canadian criminal justice. A lesson in the strengths and limitations of forensic science. A reminder of the consequences of wrongful conviction. A demonstration of the remarkable power of DNA evidence. And perhaps most importantly, proof that even after decades of silence, carefully preserved evidence can still reveal the truth. If the voice of the offender had remained absent for 31 years, the witnesses had aged, communities had changed, investigators had retired, but the DNA never forgot. When science finally learned how to ask the right questions, the evidence answered with absolute certainty, forever rewriting one of Canada's most haunting unsolved murder investigations. The public announcement identifying Calvin Hoover as Christine Jessup's killer closed one of Canada's longest and most emotionally charged homicide investigations, but it also opened an entirely different conversation. For more than 30 years, investigators had searched for one man. In the process, the case had exposed the limits of forensic science, the dangers of investigative certainty, and the devastating consequences of wrongful conviction. Now, with the identity of the offender established through DNA, attention shifted away from the mystery of who committed the crime and toward an equally important question. How had this investigation changed the future of criminal justice? The answer reached far beyond a single homicide. Inside police agencies across Canada, the Jessup investigation became required study material for detectives assigned to major crime units. It was no longer viewed solely as an unsolved murder. It had become a case study in investigative evolution. Every stage contained lessons. The initial search demonstrated the importance of immediate community response during missing child investigations. The original homicide inquiry highlighted both the strengths and limitations of conventional detective work. The wrongful conviction illustrated the danger of allowing assumptions to harden into certainty. The DNA exoneration reinforced the necessity of preserving biological evidence. The genetic genealogy breakthrough revealed an entirely new path towards solving decades-old crimes. Rarely had one investigation influenced so many aspects of modern policing. Forensic laboratories examined the case from another perspective. When Christine disappeared in 1984, DNA profiling was still largely confined to scientific research. By the late 1980s, it had entered criminal investigations. By the 1990s, it had transformed forensic identification. By the 2010s, advances in sequencing technology and investigative genealogy had expanded those possibilities even further. The Jessup case reflected that entire scientific journey. One preserved biological sample had remained scientifically valuable through every stage of forensic development. It had survived technological revolutions without changing. Only human understanding had changed. That distinction continues to shape evidence preservation policies today. Modern investigators increasingly recognize that evidence collected now may answer questions future science has not yet learned to ask. The case also strengthened appreciation for comprehensive documentation. Throughout the investigation, detectives generated thousands of pages of reports, crime scene sketches, photographs, interview transcripts, evidence logs, laboratory records, search maps, chain of custody documentation. Those records became indispensable decades later when new investigative teams inherited the file. Without accurate documentation, even revolutionary DNA technology would have possessed limited investigative value. Facts require context. Evidence requires history. Documentation preserves both. The investigation further demonstrated the importance of institutional memory. Many of the detectives who reopened the case had not participated in the original investigation. Some had not yet entered law enforcement when Christine disappeared. Yet because previous investigators had carefully organized and preserved the file, new generations could continue the work without beginning from nothing. The investigation became a relay rather than an individual effort. One generation collected evidence. Another protected it. A later generation interpreted it using scientific tools previously unavailable. Justice in this case depended upon continuity rather than speed. Another enduring lesson concerned public communication. The wrongful conviction of Guy Paul Morin profoundly influenced how police agencies discuss ongoing investigations. Officials increasingly recognize the importance of avoiding premature certainty. Public confidence remains essential, but confidence must be grounded in evidence rather than investigative momentum. The Jessup investigation reminded authorities that public declarations carry lasting consequences, particularly when later evidence contradicts earlier conclusions. Careful communication became another lasting legacy of the case. The impact extended into legal education as well. Law schools examined the investigation while discussing forensic evidence, appellate review, disclosure obligations, and wrongful convictions. Students analyzed how circumstantial evidence can appear persuasive even when underlying assumptions later prove incorrect. The case became a practical illustration of why scientific advances sometimes require legal systems to revisit settled conclusions. Justice is not strengthened by refusing to reconsider old decisions. It is strengthened by correcting them when new evidence demands it. Christine Jessup's murder also reshaped conversations surrounding cold case investigations. For many years, unsolved homicides were often viewed as investigations gradually losing their chance of resolution. Witnesses died. Memories faded. Physical evidence deteriorated. Scientific progress fundamentally altered that outlook. Today, many investigators understand that certain cases actually become more solvable over time because technology continues advancing. The Jessup investigation stands among the clearest examples of that principle. The evidence did not improve. Science did. For Christine's family, the conclusion of the investigation brought a measure of certainty after decades of unimaginable uncertainty. No criminal prosecution remained possible because Calvin Hoover had died before investigators identified him. That reality could never be changed. Yet knowing the truth carried significance of its own. For families of homicide victims, unanswered questions often become lifelong burdens. Identifying the offender cannot erase loss. It cannot restore stolen years. But it can replace uncertainty with documented fact. That distinction matters deeply within the pursuit of justice. The investigation also offered an important reminder about humility. Detectives, prosecutors, scientists, and judges all work toward the same objective: finding the truth. Yet every professional operates within the limits of available knowledge. What appears scientifically impossible today may become routine tomorrow. The Jessup case encourages investigators to remain confident in evidence while remaining humble about current limitations. History repeatedly demonstrates that science continues evolving. Future discoveries may answer questions still beyond present understanding. Cold case investigators often describe preserved evidence as silent witnesses. The phrase perfectly captures the Jessup investigation. For 31 years, the biological evidence collected in 1984 never changed. It never became less accurate. It never forgot. It simply waited. When technology finally matured, that evidence identified the offender with extraordinary certainty. The witness had been present from the beginning. Investigators simply lacked the ability to understand its testimony. Looking back across the entire chronology, the investigation unfolds almost like to separate stories joined by one piece of preserved DNA. The first story follows dedicated detectives working with limited forensic tools, ultimately reaching an incorrect conclusion despite years of sincere effort. The second follows another generation equipped with revolutionary science capable of correcting those earlier mistakes and identifying the true offender. The bridge connecting both stories was not luck. It was evidence. Properly collected, properly preserved, properly documented. That evidence ultimately became the most reliable witness in the entire investigation. Today, Christine Jessup's name remains associated not only with one of Canada's most tragic child murders, but also with one of its most influential forensic investigations. Her case continues shaping homicide training, forensic science research, evidence preservation standards, cold case methodology, investigative genetic genealogy, wrongful conviction reform. Few criminal investigations leave such a broad legacy. The search that began along a quiet rural road in October 1984 ultimately transformed the future of criminal investigation across Canada and beyond. The truth required 31 years to emerge, not because it failed to exist, but because science needed 31 years to learn how to uncover it. The resolution of Christine Jessup's murder did not mark the end of the investigation's importance. In many ways, it marked the beginning of its greatest influence. Once the identity of Calvin Hoover had been established through DNA and investigative genetic genealogy, law enforcement agencies, forensic laboratories, legal scholars, and policymakers began examining the case with renewed attention. The investigation had become more than the story of one tragic homicide. It had evolved into a comprehensive lesson about evidence, science, human judgment, and the remarkable ability of truth to survive across generations. One of the most significant aspects of the case was the role of evidence preservation. When crime scene investigators collected biological material in 1984, they followed the best forensic procedures available at the time. No one could predict how DNA science would develop. No one knew that investigative genetic genealogy would someday exist. Yet those investigators treated every biological sample as though it might become valuable in the future. That decision proved extraordinary. Because evidence, unlike memory, does not depend upon time. When properly preserved, it remains exactly as it was on the day it was collected. The evidence recovered in Christine's case survived courtroom proceedings, appeals, media attention, administrative changes, scientific revolutions. For more than 3 decades, it remained secured inside forensic storage, waiting. The investigation demonstrated why evidence preservation has become one of the most important responsibilities in modern criminal justice. A crime scene lasts only hours. Evidence can last generations. Another lesson involved the changing relationship between technology and detective work. Popular culture often portrays scientific breakthroughs as replacing traditional investigations. The Jessup case showed something very different. Science identified a direction. Detectives confirmed it. Genealogists reconstructed family relationships. Forensic laboratories verified DNA matches. Investigators reviewed historical records. Prosecutors evaluated legal standards. Every discipline depended upon the others, and no single technology solved the murder alone. The investigation succeeded because multiple forms of expertise worked together. This collaborative model increasingly defines major homicide investigations around the world. The case also highlighted the remarkable patience required in cold case work. Unlike active investigations filled with daily developments, cold case detectives frequently spend months reviewing archived documents before discovering one overlooked detail capable of changing an entire investigation. Christine's file contained thousands of pages. Interview notes, maps, evidence inventories, photographs, laboratory reports. Every document required careful review after the genetic genealogy breakthrough. Old information acquired entirely new significance when interpreted through modern scientific understanding. Facts that once appeared unrelated suddenly formed coherent patterns. The investigation illustrated how knowledge evolves, not because historical evidence changes, because human understanding improves. Professional genealogists who assisted modern homicide investigations often describe their work as solving historical puzzles. The Jessup investigation reflected exactly that process. Family trees extending across multiple generations required careful reconstruction using historical documents created decades before the murder itself. Birth registrations, marriage records, obituaries, census information, military service documents. Every verified relationship narrowed investigative possibilities. Genealogy transformed family history into an investigative resource. Yet detectives remained careful to emphasize an important distinction. Genealogy identifies possibilities. DNA establishes identity. The final conclusion always depended upon direct forensic comparison. That safeguard preserved scientific reliability throughout the investigation. The public response to the resolution reflected both relief and reflection. For many Canadians, the case had long symbolized wrongful conviction because of Guy Paul Moran's experience. Now the investigation represented something broader. It demonstrated that criminal justice systems possess the ability not only to prosecute crimes, but also to recognize mistakes and correct them when new evidence emerges. That process can be painful. It can require revisiting long-settled assumptions. But the pursuit of truth demands exactly that willingness. Justice depends not upon preserving earlier conclusions. It depends upon following reliable evidence wherever it leads. The investigation also reshaped expectations surrounding unsolved homicide cases. Families affected by other cold cases closely followed the announcement identifying Calvin Hoover. Many had spent years believing that if investigators failed to solve a murder within the first months or years, the opportunity might disappear forever. Christine Jessup's case suggested otherwise. Scientific progress continually expands investigative possibilities. Evidence collected decades earlier may answer questions impossible to resolve when originally examined. The passage of time, while creating many challenges, no longer guarantees permanent uncertainty. Across North America, police agencies responded by increasing investment in cold case review programs. Evidence storage procedures received renewed attention. Laboratories re-examined archived biological material from older investigations. Cases previously considered inactive returned to active review. The influence of Christine Jessup's investigation therefore extended well beyond its own resolution. It encouraged agencies to reconsider what might still be possible. The case also reinforced one of forensic science's most enduring principles: objectivity. Scientific evidence possesses extraordinary value precisely because it remains independent of opinion. Witnesses may disagree. Memories may fade. Investigative theories may evolve. DNA remains constant. The same biological evidence that once excluded Guy Paul Moran later identified Calvin Hoover. The evidence itself never changed. Only scientific capability changed. That distinction continues guiding forensic practice worldwide. Perhaps the most remarkable aspect of the investigation is its demonstration of continuity across generations. The detectives responding to Christine's disappearance in October 1984 could never have imagined how the case would eventually conclude. Many retired long before the investigation reached its final resolution. Some did not live to see it. Yet their work remained essential. They collected evidence carefully, documented crime scenes thoroughly, maintained investigative records, preserved opportunities they could not yet fully understand. Future investigators inherited those opportunities. Science transformed them into answers. The investigation therefore belongs not to one detective or one scientific breakthrough, but to decades of collective professional effort. Every generation contributed something indispensable. The search began with volunteers walking through rural fields. It concluded inside modern forensic laboratories, analyzing microscopic fragments of DNA. Between those two moments lay 31 years of determination. Looking back, Christine Jessup's murder occupies a unique place in Canadian criminal history. It is remembered as the tragic loss of an 8-year-old child, as one of the country's most significant wrongful conviction cases, as a landmark achievement in forensic genetic genealogy, and as enduring proof that evidence, when preserved with care and interpreted through advancing science, possesses the extraordinary ability to outlast uncertainty. The investigation reminds every detective opening an old evidence box that today's unanswered question may become tomorrow's solved case. Sometimes justice arrives quickly. Sometimes it requires decades. But as Christine Jessup's case demonstrated, the truth can remain hidden without ever being lost, waiting patiently until science finally becomes capable of revealing the voice that evidence has carried all along. More than 3 decades separated the afternoon Christine Jessup disappeared from the day investigators finally identified the man responsible for her murder. During those years, Canada changed, communities grew, technologies advanced. Entire generations entered adulthood knowing Christine's name only from newspaper archives, television documentaries, or discussions about one of the country's most controversial wrongful convictions. Yet inside evidence vaults, forensic laboratories, and cold case offices, the investigation never truly ended. The file remained active because experienced investigators understood a principle that has become central to modern homicide work. An unsolved case is not necessarily an unsolvable case. Sometimes the missing ingredient is not effort, it is time. Time changed everything. In 1984, forensic investigators relied upon methods that represented the highest scientific standards available. Hair comparison, fiber analysis, serological testing, fingerprint examination, witness interviews, crime scene reconstruction. Each discipline contributed valuable information. None could identify an unknown offender from a microscopic biological sample with the precision available today. By 2020, the landscape had transformed completely. DNA sequencing had become dramatically more sophisticated. Computational genetics had accelerated complex analysis. Genealogical databases had expanded. Historical records had become digitally accessible. Cold case investigators possessed tools unimaginable when Christine disappeared. The evidence had remained the same. Science had evolved around it. The Jessup investigation, therefore, became one of the clearest demonstrations that technological progress can fundamentally reshape criminal investigations. This lesson reached police agencies throughout Canada. Cold case units began systematically reviewing archived evidence from older homicides. Biological samples, once considered scientifically exhausted, received renewed examination. Evidence preservation policies became even more rigorous. Investigators increasingly viewed every properly stored sample as a potential source of future discoveries. The philosophy shifted. Rather than asking whether current science could solve a case, investigators began asking whether future science might. That perspective transformed long-term investigative planning. The case also reinforced another critical principle. Every investigative conclusion must remain open to reevaluation when reliable new evidence emerges. The exoneration of Guy Paul Morin became a defining example of this responsibility. The criminal justice system acknowledged that earlier conclusions, however sincerely reached, had been incorrect. The willingness to correct those mistakes ultimately strengthened public confidence rather than weakening it. Justice depends upon truth. If new scientific evidence reveals that previous assumptions were wrong, integrity requires accepting that reality. The Jessup investigation demonstrated this principle with extraordinary clarity. Legal scholars continue referencing the case when discussing wrongful convictions and forensic reform. Police academies use it to teach investigative decision-making. Forensic science programs examine it while explaining the evolution of DNA technology. Law students analyze it when studying evidentiary standards and appellate review. The influence of Christine Jessup's murder extends far beyond homicide investigation. It has become part of Canada's broader legal education. The investigation also highlighted the importance of preserving institutional knowledge. Major homicide cases often span decades. Investigators retire. Supervisors change. Laboratory personnel move into different positions. Without comprehensive documentation, continuity becomes impossible. Fortunately, Christine's case had been meticulously documented from the beginning. Every interview, every search, every laboratory examination, every investigative decision. Those records allowed entirely new investigative teams to understand work completed decades earlier. The file became a bridge connecting generations of detectives. Another enduring lesson involved patience. Modern forensic breakthroughs often create the impression that cold cases are solved overnight. Reality is very different. Investigative genetic genealogy requires months of laboratory preparation. Genealogical research demands painstaking reconstruction of family histories. Historical records must be verified. DNA comparisons undergo repeated confirmation. Traditional detective work remains essential throughout the process. The public announcement identifying Calvin Hoover represented the final step of years of careful investigation rather than one sudden discovery. That distinction is important. Science provides opportunities. Professional discipline transforms those opportunities into reliable conclusions. For Christine's family, the investigation ultimately delivered something that had seemed impossible during the darkest years following her disappearance: certainty. Although the criminal process could never proceed because Hoover had died years before his identification, the family finally knew who had taken Christine from them. For families affected by violent crime, unanswered questions often become lasting wounds. And knowing the truth cannot erase grief. It cannot restore stolen futures. But it can end decades of uncertainty. That resolution carries profound significance within the criminal justice system. The case further demonstrated that justice takes many forms. Legal punishment remains one objective. Historical truth represents another. Identifying the offender accurately ensures that criminal history reflects documented fact rather than unresolved speculation. The official record now correctly identifies the person responsible for Christine's murder. That correction matters. Not only for Christine's family, not only for Guy Paul Morin, but for the integrity of the justice system itself. Investigative genetic genealogy also prompted broader public discussion regarding privacy, ethics, and forensic technology. Authorities emphasized that genealogical information served only as an investigative lead. Traditional forensic DNA comparison remained the method establishing identification. This distinction became central to explaining how the investigation had unfolded. Genealogy suggested a direction. Direct DNA evidence confirmed the conclusion. Both stages remained essential. The investigation therefore balanced scientific innovation with established evidentiary standards. Looking back across the full chronology, the story unfolds with remarkable symmetry. A child disappears during an ordinary afternoon. A community searches desperately. A body is discovered months later. Investigators pursue every available lead. An innocent man is wrongly convicted. Science corrects that injustice. Decades pass. New technology emerges. The preserved evidence speaks again. The real offender is finally identified. Every chapter depended upon the one before it. Without careful crime scene preservation in 1984, genetic genealogy would have been impossible. Without DNA exoneration, investigators might never have reopened the case with sufficient urgency. Without continued scientific innovation, the preserved evidence might have remained permanently anonymous. The investigation succeeded because each generation built upon the work of the previous one. Today, Christine Jessup's case continues influencing homicide investigations throughout North America. Detectives approaching unsolved murders increasingly ask whether archived biological evidence deserves renewed analysis. Laboratories develop increasingly sensitive techniques. Researchers continue improving genealogical methods. Every advancement creates new opportunities. The investigation stands as enduring proof that time does not always weaken the pursuit of justice. Sometimes it strengthens it. Evidence preserved today may reveal answers decades from now. Scientific limitations accepted today may disappear tomorrow. Truth may remain silent for years. But when investigators protect the evidence and refuse to abandon the search, silence is never the same as absence. Christine Jessup's murder reminds the investigative community of a simple but powerful reality. Evidence remembers. Science evolves. Persistence matters. Together, those three forces transformed one of Canada's oldest unsolved child murders into one of its most significant examples of modern forensic justice, ensuring that the truth, however long delayed, would eventually emerge with a certainty that no rumor, assumption, or speculation could ever equal. The identification of Calvin Hoover through DNA evidence brought factual resolution to one of Canada's most significant cold cases, but it also marked the beginning of a broader legacy that continues influencing homicide investigations today. The story of Christine Jessup is no longer viewed solely as the tragic murder of an 8-year-old child. It has become a defining example of how evidence, science, and institutional persistence can work together across generations. Every stage of the investigation, from the frantic search in October 1984 to the forensic breakthrough announced in 2020, demonstrates that justice is often shaped not only by what investigators know, but by what they choose to preserve for the future. One of the investigation's most enduring contributions lies in its impact on evidence preservation. Crime scene investigators frequently make decisions under enormous pressure. Scenes must be documented quickly. Evidence must be collected carefully. Weather changes. People gather. Physical conditions evolve. Yet every decision made during those first hours can influence an investigation decades later. In Christine's case, forensic specialists collected biological evidence using the best procedures available in 1984. Although DNA technology capable of identifying the offender did not yet exist, they understood the importance of preserving every available sample. Those decisions became the foundation upon which the entire case would eventually be solved. Modern investigators often refer to evidence as an investment in the future. The Jessup investigation illustrates exactly why. No one in 1984 could predict investigative genetic genealogy. No one anticipated the computational advances that would eventually reconstruct family relationships from DNA. But because evidence had been properly protected, future scientists inherited opportunities unavailable to the original investigators. That philosophy now shapes homicide investigations throughout Canada and many other countries. The case also transformed how agencies approach cold case management. Historically, unsolved investigations were sometimes viewed as files gradually becoming less solvable as witnesses disappeared and memories faded. The Jessup investigation demonstrated that technological progress can reverse that trend. As science improves, certain categories of evidence become increasingly valuable. Biological material collected decades earlier may reveal information impossible to recover when originally examined. Rather than allowing old investigations to remain permanently inactive, many agencies now conduct periodic scientific reviews of archived evidence. Each advance in forensic capability creates another opportunity to revisit unanswered questions. Another remarkable feature of the investigation involves continuity. The detectives who responded to Christine's disappearance in October 1984 were not the same investigators who announced the identification of Calvin Hoover in 2020. Entire careers unfolded between those two moments. Some investigators retired. Others passed away. New generations entered law enforcement. Yet the investigation continued because every team carefully documented its work for those who would follow. Comprehensive reports, evidence inventories, photographs, search records, laboratory documentation. Every preserved record became a bridge connecting investigators separated by decades. The case therefore highlights the importance of institutional responsibility rather than individual achievement. Justice in long-term investigations depends upon continuity. The influence of the Jessup case also reached forensic education. Universities and police training programs began using the investigation to demonstrate the evolution of scientific methodology. Students examining forensic genetics can observe the transition from traditional serology to DNA profiling and eventually to investigative genetic genealogy within a single case history. Few investigations illustrate the development of modern forensic science so clearly. The chronology itself mirrors the advancement of the discipline. Another lesson concerns the relationship between science and certainty. During the original investigation, detectives sincerely believed they had identified the correct suspect. That confidence proved incorrect. Later, DNA evidence established Guy Paul Moran's innocence with scientific precision. Still later, investigative genetic genealogy identified Calvin Hoover. Throughout each stage, the evidence, not opinion, ultimately determined the outcome. This progression reinforces a principle now emphasized throughout criminal justice systems. Investigative confidence must always remain subject to objective scientific verification whenever possible. The Jessup investigation also reshaped conversations surrounding wrongful convictions. Legal reforms implemented after the Moran inquiry emphasized improved disclosure procedures, evidence review, forensic standards, and investigative oversight. These reforms extended beyond one case. They influence criminal investigations across Canada. The lessons learned through painful experience became safeguards designed to reduce future errors. In that sense, the investigation improved not only homicide practice, but the justice system itself. Public understanding of forensic science changed as well. Many Canadians first encountered investigative genetic genealogy through media coverage of the Jessup investigation. Authorities carefully explained that genealogy did not replace conventional forensic procedures. Instead, it generated investigative leads requiring independent DNA confirmation. This distinction helped preserve public confidence in both emerging technologies and established evidentiary standards. The investigation demonstrated that innovation succeeds best when integrated with rigorous scientific verification. For Christine Jessup's family, the passage of time never diminished the significance of finding the truth. 36 years separated her disappearance from the public identification of her killer. Those decades included unanswered questions, changing investigative theories, legal controversy, and enormous emotional strain. Although Calvin Hoover had died before investigators identified him, establishing his responsibility brought historical certainty where uncertainty had existed for generations. No legal proceeding could now occur. No sentence could be imposed. Yet the official record finally reflected verified fact rather than unresolved suspicion. Within the broader investigative community, the case continues encouraging persistence. Cold case detectives frequently describe unsolved homicide investigations as conversations with the past. Evidence collected years earlier still contains information. The challenge lies in developing methods capable of understanding it. Christine Jessup's investigation proved that today's unanswered question may become tomorrow's solved case through scientific progress alone. That understanding motivates continuing reviews of archived evidence across countless jurisdictions. Looking back across the complete investigation, one observation stands above all others. The truth never disappeared. The biological evidence identifying the offender existed from the beginning. It remained preserved through every investigation, every court proceeding, every appeal, every scientific advancement. The evidence waited patiently while human knowledge evolved. When science finally acquired the ability to interpret what had always been present, the mystery ended. That reality fundamentally changes how modern investigators view cold cases. Rather than assuming old evidence has reached its limits, they increasingly recognize that preserved evidence often contains answers still beyond current scientific understanding. The story of Christine Jessup therefore extends far beyond October 1984. It reaches every crime scene where investigators carefully package biological evidence. Every forensic laboratory developing more sensitive analytical techniques. Every cold case unit reopening forgotten files. Every family still waiting for answers. The investigation stands as enduring proof that while offenders may escape the investigative methods of one generation, they cannot assume they will escape the scientific capabilities of the next. Time changes investigators. It changes technology. It changes communities. But when evidence is preserved with care and investigators remain committed to the search for truth, time itself can become one of justice's greatest allies, carrying unanswered questions across decades until science finally provides the voice that evidence has held in silence all along. The conclusion of the Christine Jessup investigation represents more than the identification of an offender after 36 years. It represents the convergence of perseverance, scientific progress, and institutional integrity across multiple generations. Very few criminal investigations span such a remarkable period while remaining relevant to nearly every aspect of modern homicide investigation. From the first search teams walking the rural roads of Queensville in October 1984 to the forensic specialists applying advanced DNA analysis decades later, every stage contributed to an outcome that no investigator could have imagined when the case began. The story became not only one of tragedy, but one of transformation, changing how Canada approaches cold cases, forensic evidence, wrongful convictions, and the enduring pursuit of truth. One of the investigation's greatest lessons concerns patience. Modern audiences often experience criminal investigations through documentaries, news reports, or courtroom summaries where years of work unfold within a matter of hours. Reality is very different. The Jessup investigation required tens of thousands of investigative hours, thousands of witness interviews, extensive forensic examinations, multiple search operations, lengthy legal proceedings, scientific reviews spanning decades. Entire careers became connected to the pursuit of one unanswered question: who killed Christine Jessup? The answer did not emerge through a single breakthrough. It emerged because every generation added another piece to the investigation. The original detectives preserved evidence. Later investigators reviewed earlier assumptions. Forensic scientists advanced DNA analysis. And genealogists reconstructed family histories. Modern detectives verified scientific findings through conventional investigative methods. The final conclusion belonged to everyone who contributed responsibly along the way. The case also reinforced an increasingly important principle within forensic science. Evidence should never be evaluated solely according to current technological capability. Instead, investigators must preserve evidence with future scientific developments in mind. This philosophy has become central to modern evidence management. Biological samples collected today may eventually be analyzed using methods not yet invented. The Jessup investigation illustrates precisely why such long-term thinking matters. The biological evidence identifying the offender existed in 1984. Science simply required decades to understand it. Another enduring impact involves interdisciplinary cooperation. Successful homicide investigations increasingly require expertise extending far beyond traditional detective work. Crime scene specialists, DNA analysts, forensic biologists, genealogists, digital researchers, legal advisors, behavioral specialists. Every discipline contributes different forms of knowledge. The Jessup case demonstrated how these fields complement rather than replace one another. Scientific innovation expanded investigative possibilities. Experienced detectives transformed those possibilities into verified conclusions. That collaborative approach has become a defining characteristic of modern major crime investigations. The investigation further highlighted the extraordinary value of historical documentation. Every interview conducted in 1984 retained potential relevance decades later. Every evidence log, every search record, every crime scene photograph. Each document preserved context that later investigators required when interpreting new scientific findings. Without accurate documentation, advanced DNA analysis alone could not have reconstructed the complete investigative picture. The relationship between evidence and documentation proved inseparable. One preserves physical truth. The other preserves investigative understanding. Cold case investigators throughout North America frequently reference the Jessup investigation when explaining why homicide files must remain organized long after active investigative work slows. Cases rarely remain static. New witnesses emerge. Technology improves. Historical records become accessible. Scientific methods evolve. Comprehensive documentation allows future investigators to continue rather than restart earlier work. The Jessup investigation became a model of how continuity supports justice across generations. The case also contributed significantly to public understanding of investigative genetic genealogy. Authorities consistently emphasized that genealogy itself did not identify Calvin Hoover as the offender. Instead, genealogy generated an investigative lead. Traditional forensic DNA comparison established the scientific identification. This distinction remains critically important. Investigative genealogy functions as an investigative tool rather than courtroom proof by itself. Direct forensic analysis continues providing the evidentiary foundation required for reliable criminal identification. The investigation therefore balanced innovation with established scientific standards. For Christine Jessup's family, the official identification of the offender closed one chapter while preserving another. No criminal trial could now occur because Hoover had died years before investigators identified him. Nevertheless, establishing the historical truth carried profound importance. For decades, uncertainty had accompanied every anniversary, every news story, every renewed investigation. The identity of the offender was no longer unknown. That certainty could never undo the tragedy of October 1984. It could, however, ensure that history accurately reflected what the preserved evidence had finally revealed. The investigation also remains an enduring reminder that criminal justice systems must possess the courage to acknowledge error. The wrongful conviction of Guy Paul Morin represented one of the most painful chapters in Canadian legal history. His eventual exoneration demonstrated that scientific evidence must always take precedence over investigative assumptions. Correcting that injustice required humility from institutions and individuals alike. Rather than weakening public confidence, the willingness to recognize and correct mistakes ultimately strengthened the credibility of the justice system. Truth remains the highest objective. Every other consideration must follow. Looking toward the future, the Jessup investigation continues influencing research priorities within forensic science. Laboratories pursue increasingly sensitive DNA recovery methods. Researchers improve computational genetic analysis. Genealogists refine investigative techniques. Cold case units expand systematic evidence review programs. Each advancement reflects confidence that preserved evidence still contains undiscovered opportunities. The investigation proved that scientific progress does not merely solve future crimes. It can also answer questions left unresolved by the past. Perhaps the most remarkable feature of the entire investigation is its consistency. The biological evidence never changed. The offender's DNA remained exactly as it had been on the day Christine was murdered. What changed was human knowledge. Investigators became better equipped. Laboratories became more capable. Science became more precise. The truth remained constant throughout. Only humanity's ability to recognize it evolved. This realization has fundamentally reshaped modern cold case philosophy. Today, detectives approaching decades-old investigations increasingly ask not whether evidence exists, but whether contemporary science has reached the point where that evidence can finally be understood. Christine Jessup's case answered that question with extraordinary clarity. Evidence preserved responsibly possesses remarkable endurance. Scientific progress continually expands investigative possibility. Persistence bridges the distance between the two. The investigation that began with the disappearance of an 8-year-old girl on a quiet Ontario afternoon therefore became something far greater than a single homicide case. It became a lasting testament to the resilience of evidence, the evolution of forensic science, and the determination of investigators who refuse to allow time to become the final chapter. For more than 3 decades, the truth remained hidden within carefully preserved biological evidence. It never disappeared. It never weakened. It simply waited. And when science finally became capable of hearing what that evidence had been saying all along, one of Canada's most haunting cold cases finally yielded the answer that generations of investigators had pursued with unwavering determination. The murder of Christine Jessup is remembered today not simply because it was solved after decades, but because it fundamentally changed the way investigators think about justice. Some homicide investigations are remembered for the brutality of the crime. Others are remembered for the sophistication of the investigation. Christine's case is remembered for something far more significant. It proved that truth can survive long after certainty collapses. Investigative theories may fail. Courtroom verdicts may be overturned. Public opinion may change. But properly preserved evidence remains constant, waiting for science to reveal what it has always contained. Few cases illustrate that principle more powerfully than the murder of an 8-year-old girl whose killer remained unidentified for more than 36 years. The investigation began in an era when missing child cases depended almost entirely upon manpower. Neighbors searched fields. Police officers walked roadside ditches. Helicopters flew overhead. Volunteers distributed photographs. Information traveled through newspapers, radio broadcasts, and television bulletins. Every hour depended upon human observation. Every lead required physical investigation. The search reflected the investigative reality of 1984. No digital surveillance networks. No mobile phone location records. No social media. No forensic genealogy. Only determination. When Christine's body was discovered months later, investigators entered a homicide inquiry unlike anything York Region had previously experienced. Every available investigative resource was committed. Crime scene specialists documented every detail. Laboratories examined every recoverable trace. Detectives interviewed hundreds of witnesses. Thousands of investigative hours followed. The commitment never diminished. Yet commitment alone could not overcome scientific limitations. The offender left biological evidence. Investigators recovered it successfully. But contemporary science lacked the ability to identify its source. And the investigation therefore entered years of uncertainty. The subsequent wrongful conviction of Guy Paul Morin transformed